There was never any doubt in our mind that Joe had been murdered and that we fully expected him to lie when he went into the witness box.
Hey there everybody, I hope you're doing well and you are keeping safe. Today's video is another local case. This one has been requested by one of our viewers. And let me just tell you, it starts with a murder, it kicks up a giant shitstorm, and eventually ends with someone going to jail. Let's get started in the case of Joanna Yeates. Joanna Claire Yeates was born on the 19th of April 1985 to her parents David and Teresa, and they lived in a place called Ampfield in Hampshire. She was one of the lucky ones. She had a very good upbringing, a very close family life, and was lucky enough to attend private school. She was very intelligent, she went on to university, and she even managed to get her postgraduate diploma in landscape engineering from the University of Gloucestershire. After all of her education, she began working as a landscape engineer for a firm called Highland Edgar Drive, who were based in Winchester. And while working there, she met a guy called Greg Reardon in 2008. They became close. They started going on dates, and they became a couple. Now, in 2009, the company decided that they were moving to Bristol, and neither Claire or Greg wanted to lose their jobs, and they both decided that the relationship was going in the right direction, that they would move in together in Bristol. So they moved with the company across, and then after moving, Claire changed companies and went to work for a Bristol Design Partnership. In 2010, so a year after they had moved, they decided to move to the Clifton area. This is quite a nice area of Bristol. They moved into a building that had been converted into flats. Now, to the untrained eye like myself, it looks kind of like a Victorian-y style building. Tall ceilings, big windows, bay windows, that kind of thing. And as I said, it had been changed into flats. Now, in the flats were herself, the landlord, and a couple of other tenants. 2 months after they moved, everything changed. It was December 2010, and the couple were getting ready for their first Christmas in their brand new flat. Greg had to visit family in Sheffield, and Joanne was going to be spending her first time in the flat alone, and she had planned to be baking ready for a Christmas party that they were going to be throwing. So Greg went off to Sheffield for the weekend. He said that he tried to phone and to text Joanne over the weekend, but wasn't getting any responses, so he liked to assume that she was busy. He knew that she wanted to be baking, and he knew that she may have been with friends, so he kind of didn't really think about it until he came home on Sunday. This was Sunday the 19th of December. He got home and the flat was empty. He left it for a few hours, and then he tried to call Joanna, like wondering where she was, and her mobile phone rang, and it actually was in the pocket of her jacket that was hanging up in the flat, which obviously made him worry. He looked around the flat a bit more, and he noticed that their cat actually seemed, in his word, neglected. It got to midnight on the Sunday night, and still no word, no sign of Joanna, and that's when he called the police, and he called Joanna's parents to let everybody know that he believed she was missing.
Okay, basically I've gone away for the weekend and come back to find my girlfriend's not here when she was expected to be, and all her important stuff is still in the flat, such as a wallet, a keys, a phone, the glasses, everything. And basically I've just found that now, thinking that she'd come home late and she'd be here, but she isn't.
And what's her name, please?
Joanna Yeates.
So the police came over and very, very quickly swung into action. Joanna's case was looked in very quickly, and they managed to track some of her movements from the Friday night. So on the Friday night, she had gone out with work colleagues and friends after work to the Ram's Arms pub in Bristol, had gone and had a few drinks, hung out for a while, and then around 8 p.m. she left the pub and started her half an hour walk home. She can then be seen on CCTV film going into Waitrose for a little while, wandering around, leaving empty-handed. She's seen going into her Tesco Extra, buying herself a pizza, and then going to the Bargain Booze, I believe it was called, and buying herself a couple of bottles of cider before going home. She's also known to have called her best friend at around 8:30 that night. After that, there is no more footage of her, so it can be assumed that she then went home. What was noted in her flat was her phone was there, her purse was there, her bag was there, her keys were there. The bottles of cider were on the side, one of them had been open, a couple of mouthfuls had been taken, and the pizza was missing. The pizza being missing, I'm not going to lie, it just twitches my brain, and I will explain furthermore, but it does twitch my brain really, really badly. The signs were that she was either taken from her flat, or something had happened and she'd had to rush out, and something had happened after that. Friends of Yeates and Reardon started a social media campaign. They started asking for help, anybody had seen her, any information they could possibly find. Police asked Yates's parents and Reardon to do a couple of press conferences. The first of the conferences being on the 21st of December and the second one being on the 23rd. They were appealing for any information that they could possibly find. The investigation was called Operation Brave, and it comprised of 70 detectives, uniform staff and civilians. They urged people to come forward with any information they could find, and then this is where they started discussing the possible lightly coloured vehicle. May have been a 4x4, they weren't entirely sure. And they were inundated with thousands of call. Crime Stoppers offered £10,000 reward, and then the Sun offered £50,000. The reward was for any information that led to a conviction. There was a young woman who was attending a party at a neighbouring house who recalled hearing 2 loud screams coming from the direction of Yates's flat at about 9 p.m. And then there was a guy who lived behind Yates's home who said that he heard a woman calling for help. Why did neither of these people help, or at least look into where the sounds come from? So in our house, if I hear a scream outside, the first thing I'm going to do is look out the curtain and try and decide where that came from. And I understand that people don't like getting involved. There's a lot more fear for yourself nowadays. There's a lot more he could be carrying a knife, I don't know. People don't want to get involved, and I understand that. But surely if you heard screams and you couldn't pinpoint it, I can kind of understand not doing anything. But if you hear a woman screaming for help, specifically screaming for help, and you specifically hear those words, even if you don't investigate, why didn't he call the police and be like, hey, I've just heard this at around this address, is there any chance someone could come and do some investigating? One of the first people to be investigated was Reardon, and I think this was mainly to be able to take him out of the suspect list more than anything, because he had a strong alibi that he was with his family in Sheffield, but they also searched his mobile and they searched his laptop, and then he was ruled out as a suspect and became purely a witness. Unfortunately, on Christmas Day morning of all fucking mornings, Joanna Yeates' body turned up. It turned up down at a country lane, it was called Longwood Lane, near a golf course. But on the opposite side of the road was a quarry, and her body was found next to a wall, and there was actually blood found on the wall that was hers. And it was it's questionable as to whether or not the attempt had been to throw her over the wall and for her to roll into this quarry and then disappear. But she didn't. So she was found, as I say, Christmas Day morning, and her body was frozen. So there were many questions that this raised. So did something happen? Did she get lost? Did she freeze to death? And so her body obviously had to go to the mortuary and have a post-mortem. Now the post-mortem was then delayed. So the post-mortem started on the 26th, but it was delayed to have the results until the 28th because of her being frozen. At first glances, there was no indication that she had suffered foul play. She didn't look like she'd been stabbed or shot or anything like this. She just looked like she had died, which was just like worrying and questionable. However, this again changed when on the 28th of December the results of the autopsy were able to be seen. On the 28th of December, the results of the autopsy showed that Joanna was actually strangled, and she had 43 small little injuries, including scratches, bruises. She even had a fractured nose, so something had hit her in the face. And now this was definitely a homicide case. Something I want to mention really fucking quickly, and I don't want to go into this in detail, was the media coverage of this case was fucking horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. There are documentaries about this case that only lightly actually touch on Joanna's murder, which I don't like. I want to tell her story where she remained the central fucking point of the story, because she is the unfortunate victim who lost her life. So to me, that's the importance. But there was a media shitstorm that hit with this. They were running stories left, right and centre. Of course, finding the body on Christmas Day, at the time there were no papers on Christmas Day and there were no papers on Boxing Day. So by the 28th, they were saying whatever the fuck they wanted to say. I think at one point they printed a story about Joanna being bound and beaten and left to freeze to death. There was no proof of this at the time. They just wanted something to put into print because they were running behind, because the reports were able to still be on the TV. And they wanted to sell papers, so they wrote whatever the fuck they liked. And this was before the media carnage that happened with the News of the World having to be shut down, with the reports of telephone lines being leaked, like being tapped and stuff like that. So this was when the media were fucking monsters. And it was just a shitstorm. And I wanted to tell you that because of what happened to Yeates' landlord, Christopher Jeffries. As I mentioned earlier, Christopher Jeffries lived in the same flats as Yeates and Reardon. And of course, he would have had a key to the apartment because he was the landlord. So when Joanna first went missing, he gave his original story to the police of what he had been doing. It was a very basic story. I did this, I came home, I spent the night indoors alone. His alibi was very, very weak, according, as far as the police are concerned, because there's nobody there to corroborate it and to back him up. After a couple of days, he remembered other information, and being a good citizen, he phoned the police to tell them this extra bit of information. He thinks he remembered seeing some people down the side of the building, and so he wanted to let them know that he had remembered this in case it was a vital piece of information. And he said that when he gave this information, the officer that he spoke to him with suspicion. He was then arrested on suspicion of murder of Joanna Yeates. So because his story had changed, he became suspicious to the police. And I kind of get that, I understand that. But this poor guy, his life was ruined in the next 2 days. Absolutely destroyed. So he was arrested. While he was arrested and being questioned, his flat was checked for evidence and DNA and that kind of stuff. They wanted to keep him in longer, so they applied to the magistrate, and they were about to apply for a second time before they let him go. He was being questioned for 2 days solid. Now, during those 2 days, somehow, whether it was leaked or whether it was a media tap, we don't know, somehow journalists found out that he was under suspicion, and they pinned the murder on him. As far as the press were concerned, this man was guilty. So there was nobody in the south of England, or possibly the whole of England, who didn't know Chris Jeffries' name by this point. He was all over the papers, he was all over the news channels, he was everywhere, and as far as everybody was concerned, he was a killer. But after being questioned, he was released because he didn't do it. But as far as people were concerned, he was a killer. And this is why I needed to mention the press shitstorm, because this poor guy had his life just ripped from him. There is one point where he's being questioned by the press, like, have you got any comments, and he's just saying no comments. Now, the reason he was saying no comments is because he is a decent gentleman, and this is a case that he doesn't know any answers about. He doesn't want to talk gossip about Joanna's possible killer, or the case, or her last movements, or anything. He doesn't want to be involved because he doesn't know anything, so why would he be involved? But people saw no comment as, I did it, kind of bullshit. And yeah, he was very lucky in the sense that later on, much later on, years later, when the press finally had to answer to somebody, and like, as I said, like, the news of the world got closed down and the taps were discovered and all this kind of stuff, he actually did get a decent settlement. But that doesn't make up for the damage that the press caused him. So the police had to continue trying to find information. And one thing they found quite interesting was there was a guy called Vincent Tabak who had phoned in to the hotline and had actually pointed a finger at Chris Jeffries. He was a tenant with his girlfriend in one of the other flats in the same building as Yeates and Jeffries. He had said to the police that Jeffries was lying about being home all night, and that his car had changed position overnight. So, like, it had turned around. So he must have gone out in his car. But the only reason he mentioned his car was because the police had said that they were interested in talking to someone with a lightly coloured car. There was no clear video evidence for them to even know what type of vehicle it was. They just, what type of car it was. They just knew it was a car and it was lightly coloured. And Jeffries had a car that was lightly coloured. So Tabak had put himself into the investigation by pointing his finger at Jeffries. And this interested the police so much that they wanted to question Tabak. Now, Vincent Tabak is originally from the Netherlands. And he was over visiting family by this point because it was Christmas. And they were so interested in talking to him that they actually sent an officer to the Netherlands to speak with him. Now, this officer, when they came back, they instantly said that there was something off about him. They didn't get a good feeling for him. They didn't, he wasn't trustworthy. They just didn't feel good about it. And so when he returned, they decided they wanted to speak to him further. So who was Vincent Tabak? He was born on the 10th of February 1978, and he was a very intelligent man. He was described by people who knew him as an intelligent loner. He went all the way through school, college, university. He did actually make a start on his PhD, with his paper being published in 2008. And he too was sort of into architecture, which I'm not going to lie, I'm wondering if maybe there was some connection there, but as far as we are aware, him and Joanna had never actually spoken. He met his current partner, and in 2009 the pair of them moved into Clifton. One thing that made him stand out was when he was interviewed, he specifically asked the police about what forensic details they had, what forensic evidence they had. And this is like weirdly seen by intelligent killers. They like to put themselves in the middle of the investigation. They want to know that they are smarter than the police. They want to know that they are outsmarting everybody. It's like a thing they can't avoid asking. It's like it strokes part of your ego or something along those lines, like knowing that you are better than the police, I guess. On the 18th of January, Reconstruction of the murder appeared on Crime Watch. If you don't know what Crime Watch is, huge program in the UK. Reconstructs crimes. It's there to kind of try and jog people's memories as to if they've seen anything. And they received over 300 leads from that reconstruction alone. But it did help them because they were able to come to a realization that Joanna's body would have been moved, and it may have been moved in a holdall or a suitcase or something along those lines. Because this is so clever. So she didn't have any shoes on, and one of her socks was actually missing. So the bottom of her feet were not dirty. The bottom of her sock was not dirty. So she had not stepped foot on the outside of her flat, like outside, because there would have been evidence of that on the bottom of her sock, on the bottom of her foot. So for her to get to where her body was found, she must have been carried. So they had that information, and then they also had an anonymous female tip-off that pointed a finger at Vincent Tabak. So they continued investigating Tabak, and then on the 20th of January, so 2 days after this, Tabak was actually arrested. And what they discovered was that Tabak was actually a bit of a sexual deviant, I believe. It's probably the best way to describe him. So he had a large interest in pornography, which is not a problem. However, he did have an interest in extremely graphic and violent pornography. He was interested in women being exploited. He watched videos of women being strangled and those kind of things. He had a particular interest in women of the same physical appearance as Joanna. And they even found a photograph of a woman who looked pretty much identical to Joanna. And she was wearing a pink top that she had picked up and it was exposing her breasts. But the top was very similar to the top that Joanna was wearing when she was killed. He did say that he believed that there was police corruption that was framing him. And I don't know if that was the reason or if there was another reason, but for some unknown reason, his pornography was not allowed to be used as evidence in the case. However, we also know that he was on Google looking up local escorts and prostitutes. When he travelled away for work, he looked up prostitutes and escorts as well, and he did use their services. So even though these are consenting, he was with his girlfriend, and I don't think she had an inkling as to what was happening at the time. If she did, fair play to him. Everybody, each to their own. Everybody has their own kings. I mean, I'm not here to shame anybody, but I believe she didn't know. Either way, it gave a clear picture that Tabak was a sexually motivated character. He didn't seem to stray far away from sexual motivation. While collecting evidence to support their case, the police did actually find DNA evidence and some fibres. So it turns out the fibres on Joanna's body were from Tabak's car. And there was DNA evidence that was found behind her knees. So she must have been carried at some point. And the DNA evidence was not of the best quality. They tested it initially, and it did come back to match Tabak, but because it wasn't of the best quality, and because they didn't want it to be thrown out of court because of that, it went through a process that purifies it. It went through the purification process, and it had a match with Tabak's DNA that was in doubt by 1 in 1 billion chance. So there is 1 in 1 billion chance that it is not Tabak's DNA. So to me, that's fucking good enough. So he ended up obviously having to go to court. He originally claimed innocence. He did not kill her. But he then ended up confessing to the prison chaplain, and somehow that changed his plea. Now, I looked into this because to me, if you speak to a chaplain, that's not allowed to be told to anybody else. That's just between you, the chaplain, and God, as far as I was aware. So I researched this because I was like, this seems a bit dodgy. And so what happened was, the guy who he spoke to was a volunteer chaplain. So he's not the main chaplain, he's a volunteer chaplain. And he listened, and he said to Tabak, I'm going to have to tell the senior chaplain about this. And Tabak was like, well, I'm not telling you anymore. That was it. He stopped talking. But the reason that he was able to talk about it was because Tabak was not a Christian. So as far as the chaplain was concerned, this man was non-religious, and therefore his confession to God, who he did not believe in, didn't count as being told in confidence. And I kind of get it. Because if you're telling it to God and you are a Christian, then you're telling it to God. But he's not a Christian. He's not religious at all. So therefore, he's just confessing to some dude who sat next to him. He ended up changing his plea to manslaughter. He has never said that he murdered her, but he said manslaughter. Because basically, and I love this, this is his story. He went to see her, and he was with her chatting, and he tried to kiss her. At which point, she screamed. Who the fuck screams? We'll come back to that. She screamed, and he tried to make her quiet by putting his hands over her mouth and then accidentally strangled her. I don't know if I put too much faith in other humans, but I'd like to believe that if you killed someone accidentally, no malice, no intention, that you would call the police and not dispose of the body hoping you were never found out. But apparently he put his hands over her face to stop her screaming and then accidentally strangled her. So let's circle back to this. 1. Have you ever had someone attempt to kiss you and caused you to scream in their face? Like, I've had people try to kiss me and just gone, whoa, not for me. But, like, I don't think I've ever physically needed to scream at somebody in their face. The only reason I could think that someone would scream in someone's face is if they were trying to essay them. If it was just a confusion and a mix-up of signals and there was an accidental try to kiss, That to me shouldn't result in someone screaming in someone else's face. Secondly, there were signs of a struggle. There wasn't just an accidental, like, oh shit, I broke your neck. Like, something smashed her in the face. She had a broken nose. Cuts, bruises, everything. Like, there was a tussle. She put up a fight of some description. Now, I didn't mention earlier, but, like, in the autopsy, there was no sign of SA. However, that doesn't mean that what happened didn't cause the killer to gain some form of sexual gratification from it. The sexual gratification could literally have just been from killing someone. It doesn't need to involve the physical act itself. Which is horrible, but worth noting because of the type of character that Tabak seems to be. Whatever happened on the night, unfortunately, no one will ever know the complete truth. So in court, obviously, the prosecution had to put together a side of the story that they think may have happened. And they put together that they thought that Tabak had knocked on the door, and within moments of her answering the door, he had his hands around her throat. Put this next to Tabak's, oh, I tried to kiss her story. Either way, it resulted in Tabak strangling. Yeah, I guess maybe it could have been something in the middle of the two stories, but as I say, we don't know. We don't have a 100% guarantee of what that would have been. So after deliberation in court, Tabak was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison, and that is where he currently is. But I do have a teeny little tidbit more for you people. When they investigated his PC, they found other images that they needed to do a separate trial for. These were nothing to do with the Joanna case. However, they did find 145 indecent images of children on his PC. He went to court in 2015 for these. He was found guilty of possession of these images and placed on the register for 10 years and will never be allowed to work with children or young people ever. Now, I didn't mention the pizza, and I promised I'd mention the pizza. The pizza is like confusing and obvious, and at the same time makes me kind of want to gag. So Joanna bought a pizza on her way home before she was murdered. When they investigated the flat, there was no pizza box. There was no pizza. When they did her autopsy, she had not eaten the pizza. So the pizza disappeared. What happened to the pizza? The reason that I found it so intriguing is because did he take her pizza? Sounds pathetic, it sounds ridiculous. However, flip it. What kind of sadistic asshole murders someone and then takes her pizza and eats it without any remorse for what he's just done? That's the only thing I can think as to what happened to the fucking pizza. And it kind of, like, as I say, it niggled my brain really badly. Because it's like, what kind of sadistic asshole? Like, I understand that people don't show remorse. I don't understand how they don't show remorse. I don't understand how people don't have remorseful feelings for doing these kind of actions. But who the fuck steals the pizza and then didn't steal the cider? No, cider's still there in the bottle. But the pizza disappeared. And I don't know why it bugged me as much as it did, but it did. He ate her pizza. Or if he didn't, did he give the pizza to his girlfriend? That's even worse. See, the pizza niggles the brain far more than it should. So that's the case of Joanna Yeates. It would have been 15 years ago that she lost her life. As I said earlier, the press blew the case up. And unfortunately, somewhere amongst all of the carnage that the press caused, the poor innocent girl who lost her life, her memory got lost as well. So I'd like to show Joanna's face just one last time so we can all remember this beautiful woman and what she went through. Thank you all for watching and for such an amazing year. The last few months have just been phenomenal, and I'm eternally grateful to everybody. If you've made it this far and you haven't yet subscribed, please do click that subscribe button. And if you want to leave a comment about this case, or if you want to suggest a case for me to look at in 2026, please do. Until the new year, look after yourself, be safe, but have fun, because it's the holiday season, so have some fun. But please be safe, look after yourselves, look after each other, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.